Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Usually, when we look at royal successions in Western Europe, there is an expectation of this rigid, orderly transition.
Right. The monarch dies, the heir steps up, they put the crown on their head, and the machinery of government just kind of grinds forward.
Yes, it is supposed to be very linear.
Very predictable.
Exactly. Well, it is the ideal scenario, certainly. It provides the continuity and stability that those medieval societies required above all else.
Because when the central authority is strong, trade flows.
Right. The borders are secure and the laws are actually enforced.
But when you look at the landscape of 12th century England and Normandy, that orderly transition entirely shatters.
It completely falls apart.
Yeah, we are diving into a brutal civil war stretching from 1138 to 1153, a period known as the Anarchy.
It was an era defined by scorched earth, broken loyalties, and, just shifting alliances.
And there is this haunting phrase from the Peterborough Chronicle that I think just captures it perfectly. They recorded that men said openly that Christ and his saints were asleep.
It is a striking piece of historical literature, really. It captures the sheer despair of a civilian population caught in a 19-year war of attrition.
This is 19 years of misery.
Yeah. You had two rival factions, both claiming a legitimate right to the English throne, and neither possessed the overwhelming military advantage necessary to actually secure it.
And so that is our mission for you on this deep dive. We are going to untangle this highly complex web of succession crises, military strategies, and political betrayals.
It is a very tangled web.
It really is. We are going to look past the surface-level timeline and dig into the underlying systems of the period. We will examine how a unified kingdom fractured and how the mechanics of medieval warfare shifted from open battlefields to grinding sieges.
And how the very concept of feudal loyalty broke down under severe economic pressure.
Right. But to understand how England descended into a period where the divine seemed to have abandoned the land, we have to start, 18 years before the war even began.
We do.
We have to go back to a cold night in November 1120 with a shipwreck.
The disaster of the White Ship. I mean, it is the catalyst for the entire political collapse that follows.
Let us set the scene here. The White Ship was making a cross-channel journey.
Right, from Barfleur in Normandy to England.
And the sources indicate the crew and passengers had been drinking heavily before departure.
Yes, there was a lot of celebrating.
So it hits a rock just outside the harbor and sinks, drowning around 300 people.
Which is a terrible tragedy on its own, but the critical casualty was a young man named William Adelin.
Right.
He was the only legitimate son of King Henry I.
And the loss of William Adelin just threw the entire inheritance of the English throne and the Duchy of Normandy into total chaos.
Utter chaos. Henry I had spent his entire reign ruthlessly consolidating his power. He built a highly efficient administrative state, secured his borders, and all of that relied on a clear, undisputed succession.
And with William gone, that certainty just vanished overnight.
It did.
Now, at the time, the rules of succession in Western Europe were not entirely codified, right? It wasn't just a simple matter of the oldest child automatically taking the entirety of the estate.
No. The legal frameworks were quite fluid. In certain regions of France, male primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits all the titles and lands, was becoming the standard.
But the Anglo-Norman tradition was messier.
Much more complex. The custom often involved dividing lands among male heirs.
So the eldest son would typically take the patrimonial lands, right?
Yes, the ancestral territories in Normandy, which were considered the core of the family's legacy.
And the younger sons.
They would be given the acquired lands, which in this case meant England, since it had been conquered by William the Conqueror in 1066.
Okay, so when Henry I lost his only legitimate son, he didn't just lose a child. He lost his entire unified succession plan.
He did. And his solution was unprecedented for the Anglo-Norman world. He decided to make his daughter, Empress Matilda, his sole heir.
Which was a bold move. And he forced his court to swear oaths of allegiance to Matilda, demanding they recognize her as his successor.
Over and over again. He made them do this repeatedly in 1127, 1128, and 1131.
Wait, he just forces the most powerful barons in the realm to swear fealty to a female heir. In medieval law, isn't an oath extracted under intense royal pressure legally fragile? I mean, did anyone actually intend to keep those oaths?
Well, the sources suggest a great deal of quiet resentment.
I bet.
The Anglo-Norman elite were profoundly uncomfortable with the idea of a female ruler. Women in this era could hold land and exercise authority as widows or regents, sure.
But a queen regnant.
Right, the idea of a woman ruling in her own right, commanding armies and dispensing justice, that was entirely outside their political framework.
So they just nodded along to appease an aging king.
Pretty much. They took the oaths because Henry I was a formidable, highly intimidating monarch. Defying him openly meant losing your lands or facing exile.
And then, to make matters worse, Henry arranges for Matilda to marry Geoffrey V of Anjou in 1128.
Yes.
From everything we read in the sources, this marriage was a public relations nightmare with the Anglo-Norman barons.
Oh, it's terribly unpopular.
Mhm.
The Angevins, the people of Anjou, were the historic enemies of the Normans.
Hated each other.
They had been fighting vicious border wars for generations. They had different cultural practices, different styles of dress, and a deeply ingrained animosity.
So by marrying his daughter to the Count of Anjou, Henry I was essentially demanding that his Norman barons accept their traditional hated enemy as their future overlord.
Exactly the issue.
It sounds like a sudden corporate vacuum. Imagine you have a designated CEO, Matilda, and she is out of the country, deeply entangled in a highly controversial merger with a rival firm, Anjou.
That is a great way to put it.
And while she is stuck dealing with that unpopular merger, the current CEO suddenly dies.
That captures the political geography perfectly. Because when Henry I unexpectedly died of an illness in December 1135 near Lyon-la-Forêt, Matilda and Geoffrey were stuck in Anjou.
They were completely out of position.
Entirely out of position. In fact, they had recently been supporting a localized rebellion against Henry's own forces in southern Normandy.
Which further alienated them from the Norman barons they were supposed to rule.
Yes, their timing couldn't have been worse.
And this is where the opportunistic board member swoops into headquarters. Enter Stephen of Blois.
Stephen of Blois, Henry I's nephew.
Right. The moment he hears of the king's death, Stephen leaves Boulogne, crosses the channel in the middle of winter, and speeds directly to London.
And the logistics of that crossing alone demonstrate his sheer ambition.
Because winter crossings were dangerous.
Highly dangerous. Winter crossings of the English Channel were often deadly. But Stephen recognized that the throne would belong to whoever could seize the physical apparatus of the state first.
So he arrives in London, and the crowds just proclaim him king. Why did the Londoners support him over Matilda?
Well, the citizens of London were primarily concerned with trade and stability. They wanted a strong military protector present in the country to secure the trade routes and maintain order.
And Matilda was hundreds of miles away.
Right, she was in Anjou. Stephen was standing right in front of him. He was a known quantity, he was wealthy, and importantly for them, he was male.
So they threw their weight behind him.
Yes. The Londoners traditionally claimed a right to participate in the election of the king, and they supported Stephen in exchange for promises of new rights and privileges.
But seizing the capital is only half the battle. He needed the treasury.
Crucially,
And he had a very critical asset for that, his younger brother, Henry of Blois.
Henry of Blois was the Bishop of Winchester, and he was one of the wealthiest and most influential men in England.
And he really tipped the scales.
His assistance was the deciding factor in Stephen's usurpation. Henry handed over the royal treasury at Winchester.
Which was substantial.
Very. This was not just a symbolic chest of gold. This was the accumulated wealth of Henry I's entire reign-vast reserves of silver pennies and bullion.
Plus, he brought the church on board.
Right. Henry of Blois delivered the backing of the church. He convinced the Archbishop of Canterbury that the late king had been wrong to insist on the oaths to Matilda.
And we have to look at the justification they used for that, because it's fascinating. Hugh Bigelid, the royal steward, steps forward.
Yes, he does.
And he swears that Henry I changed his mind on his deathbed and nominated Stephen instead. I mean, did anyone actually buy that deathbed conversion story?
It is highly unlikely.
It sounds like a convenient lie they all agreed to swallow because Stephen held the purse strings.
It was almost certainly a convenient fiction, yes.
Yeah.
But it provided the necessary veneer of legality.
They needed a loophole.
The archbishop needed a canonical reason to release the barons from the oaths they had sworn to Matilda. Hugh Bigod's testimony gave them exactly that.
So they argued the oaths were sworn under duress.
Yes, and that ignoring them was necessary to prevent a civil war. So, with the church's blessing, the treasury secured, and the capital on his side, Stephen was crowned on the 26th of December, 1135.
Less than a month after Henry died.
Incredibly fast.
But, taking the throne and holding it are two very different things.
Absolutely.
Let us move into how Stephen attempted to consolidate his power between 1135 and 1138, because he immediately faced threats on multiple fronts.
He really didn't have a moment of peace.
Right off the bat, David I of Scotland, who is Matilda's maternal uncle, invaded the north of England, taking Carlisle and Newcastle.
David was ostensibly supporting Matilda's claim, but he was also an opportunist. He was looking to expand Scottish territory into northern England.
And Stephen responded with impressive speed, right? He rapidly marched a mercenary army north to Durham to confront David.
Yes, he moved his forces very quickly.
But instead of fighting, they strike a deal.
Stephen realized that a drawn-out war in the north would leave his southern ports highly vulnerable to an Angevin invasion.
He couldn't fight a two-front war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right, so he compromised. He allowed David's son, Prince Henry, to keep certain lands in England, including the earldom of Huntingdon, but he demanded the return of other key northern territories.
So it neutralized the immediate Scottish threat.
It did, but it required conceding valuable land and revenues right at the start of his reign.
So Stephen then returns south and holds an incredibly lavish Easter court in 1136 at Westminster. The sources emphasize his spending here.
He spent an extraordinary amount.
He is handing out grants of land, earldoms, and royal revenues to secure the loyalty of the Anglo-Norman barons. He is essentially buying their continued support.
He was trapped in a cycle of patronage. Because his claim to the throne was contested, he felt he had to constantly reward his supporters to keep them from defecting to Matilda.
Right.
He even issued a coronation charter, making broad concessions to the church, promising them greater autonomy.
So he is trading away the centralized power his uncle had spent a lifetime building.
Piece by piece.
And while he's draining the treasury to buy friends in London, the borders are catching fire. In Wales, a localized victory against Norman forces at the Battle of Lelchur sparked a widespread rebellion.
Yes, the situation in Wales deteriorated rapidly. The Welsh terrain was fundamentally unsuited to traditional Norman warfare.
Because Norman warfare relied on heavy cavalry charges.
Right, and you can't charge heavy horses through thick Welsh forests and mountains.
So the Welsh utilized guerrilla tactics.
They did, striking quickly from the forest and retreating before the heavy Norman knights could even engage them.
Stephen sent mercenary forces to pacify the region, right?
He tried, but the expeditions failed. By 1137, Stephen effectively abandoned his attempts to put down the Welsh rebellion. He conceded the territory to focus on his primary rivals.
Because those primary rebels were moving across the Channel. Geoffrey of Anjou attacked Normandy in 1136.
And Stephen traveled to the duchy in 1137 to mount a defense.
But he doesn't even get to fight Geoffrey. His own army just implodes.
The internal friction was too severe. Stephen relied heavily on professional Flemish mercenaries.
Commanded by an experienced soldier named William of Ypres.
Yes, but the local Normanders absolutely despised these mercenaries.
Right, just because they were foreign?
They viewed them as violent outsiders who were taking the royal pay that the barons felt entitled to themselves.
Ah, so it is a classic clash between professional soldiers and feudal levies.
Very much so. The animosity escalated into physical violence within Stephen's own camp.
They were fighting each other.
Yes, and the Norman forces ultimately just deserted him.
Wow, that is a total breakdown of command.
Without the support of the local barons, Stephen simply could not sustain a campaign against Geoffrey.
So he was forced to negotiate a truce.
He had to. He agreed to pay Geoffrey 2,000 marks per year to keep peace along the borders.
Think about the financial reality of this. We are looking at a king who looks somewhat successful on paper, right? He stopped the Scottish invasion. He secured a truce in Normandy.
But the cost was catastrophic.
He is paying off his enemies, he is buying the loyalty of his friends, and he is maintaining these really expensive mercenary armies.
And the result was predictable. By 1138, just 3 years into his reign, the vast treasury accumulated by Henry I was completely empty.
Stephen was bankrupt.
Entirely out of funds.
And when a central government goes broke, the very nature of how it exerts power has to change. Stephen cannot afford to field standing armies anymore.
He doesn't have the coin.
The money is gone, the North is compromised, Wales is lost, and a major betrayal is brewing. This shift in resources directly dictates the realities of 12th century warfare.
It really forces a change in tactics.
We need to look closely at how this civil war was actually fought. Because when people think of medieval warfare, They often imagine cinematic, pitched battles with thousands of knights charging at each other on an open field.
Which is largely a modern fiction.
Right.
In the 12th century, pitched battles were considered incredibly risky, almost reckless endeavors.
Why so risky?
Well, a commander could lose his life, his army, and his entire political cause in a single afternoon. Prudent commanders avoided them at all costs.
So what did the warfare of the Anarchy actually look like?
It was characterized by attritional warfare.
Explain the mechanics of that. What does attritional warfare actually look like on the ground for the people living through it?
It was known as the chevauchée. It was a prolonged campaign of raiding and destruction. The goal was not to destroy the enemy's army in combat, but to destroy their economic base.
So they would just ravage the countryside.
Yes, armies would move through enemy territory, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, destroying mills, and terrifying the local peasantry.
That is brutal.
It was. You wanted to prove that the opposing lord could not protect his own lands, thereby encouraging his vassals to defect. You wanted to starve the enemy garrisons out of their strongholds.
It is pure economic warfare targeting the civilian population. That explains why the Peterborough Chronicle describes the period with such utter despair.
The peasants were bearing the absolute brunt of these tactics.
So the armies executing these tactics were built around a core unit called the Familia Regis, right?
Yes, the inner circle of household knights, permanently attached to the king or a high-ranking lord. They were highly trained, heavily armored men.
Let us break down that armor for a second because we see the term hauberk frequently in the sources. What exactly is a medieval knight wearing during this period?
A hauberk is a knee-length shirt of interlocking iron rings, essentially chainmail.
And how effective is that?
Very effective against slashing weapons. But it was heavy, and it was expensive, and it was vulnerable to crushing blows or a direct thrust from a lance.
And these knights were supported by infantry.
Infantry, crossbowmen, and professional mercenaries like the Brabançons and the Flemish.
But the real anchors of this war were the castles.
Absolutely. They dictated the entire flow of the conflict.
Castles were the administrative and military hubs of the 12th century. If you controlled the castle, you controlled the surrounding agricultural output.
Right. And during this period, we see a significant transition in military architecture.
Tell us about that.
Traditional earthwork and timber structures known as motte and bailey castles were still very common. They featured a raised earth mound, the motte topped with a wooden keep, and surrounded by an enclosed courtyard, the bailey.
And those were pretty quick to put up, right?
Yes, they could be constructed rapidly, using local unskilled labor.
But we also start seeing the emergence of square stone keeps.
Yes, stone keeps were becoming the ultimate status symbol and defensive stronghold. They required skilled masons, vast amounts of capital, and years to construct.
And the walls were incredibly thick.
Very thick. And the critical factor here is that defensive engineering heavily outweighed offensive siege technology at the time.
Let us talk about that siege technology, because the sources mention mangonels and ballistae.
Right. A mangonel was a large timber siege engine that used twisted ropes torsion to hurl heavy stones or incendiary devices.
And a ballista.
A ballista was essentially a massive mounted crossbow that fired heavy bolts.
So how effective were these against those new stone keeps?
Against a wooden palisade, they were quite effective. But against a newly built square stone keep, a mangonel was essentially just scratching the paint.
You couldn't batter down those walls.
Not quickly.
Which means sieges were not about breaking in, they were about starving the defenders out.
Precisely. A siege was a blockade. And this led to a really fascinating tactical development frequently mentioned in the sources: the construction of countercastles.
I love this concept. A countercastle is essentially an offensive fortification.
Yes, the besieging army would build a temporary castle, often just an earthwork and timber ring, just outside the bow shot of the enemy stronghold.
Like the earthworks known as the rings near Corfe Castle in Dorset. That is a prime archaeological example.
Exactly. These countercastles served multiple purposes. They protected the besieging army from sudden sorties by the defenders.
So they wouldn't get ambushed from the castle.
Right. They also provided a secure platform for their own siege weaponry. But most importantly, they choked off the enemy's ability to resupply or communicate with the outside world.
It is like if you own a business and your competitor sets up a heavily armed storefront directly across the street, specifically designed to intercept all your delivery trucks until you go bankrupt.
That is a very accurate comparison.
But this raises a vital question for you to consider regarding the mindset of the commanders. If pitched battles are rare and sieges take months of sitting in the mud waiting for people to starve, how did they actually measure winning in this era?
Winning was measured in territory controlled, revenues extracted, and the political submission of local lords.
So it was a slow, grinding process.
Very slow, a process of territorial dominance. He
Mhm.
chipped away at the enemy's sphere of influence one valley, one castle at a time.
And the leaders of the two factions approached this grueling task with very different profiles. Let us examine King Stephen first.
Yeah.
The chronicles describe him as wealthy, affable, and highly skilled in personal combat. He had a notable ability to move military forces rapidly over long distances, which we saw with his dash to London and his march to Durham.
He was a capable soldier.
But he carried a significant psychological burden regarding his family's reputation.
Yes, Stephen's father, Stephen Henry of Blois, notoriously fled from the siege of Antioch during the First Crusade.
He abandoned the Crusader army when things looked dire.
He did, and that legacy hung heavily over Stephen. Many modern historians suggest that a deep-seated desire to avoid his father's reputation for cowardice influenced some of Stephen's rasher military decisions.
He felt he had something to prove.
He felt a constant, pressing need to prove his martial valor, sometimes at the expense of strategic patience.
On the other side of the conflict, you have Empress Matilda. She had a profound grounding in imperial government.
She did. During her first marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor, she had presided over court cases, acted as a regent in Italy, and traveled with the imperial army on campaign.
She understood the mechanics of power.
She knew how to govern, but she faced an insurmountable structural disadvantage.
Her gender.
Yes. As a woman in the 12th century, she was barred from personally leading troops into combat.
And the entire feudal system was built around a martial king who could physically lead his barons into battle.
Right. Matilda had to rely entirely on male commanders to execute her military strategy.
Furthermore, the contemporary chroniclers, who were all male clerics, judged her harshly.
Very harshly. They frequently portrayed her as arrogant and imperious.
They said she demanded compliance and issued threats.
And those exact traits were entirely accepted, even praised as signs of strong kingship in her father, Henry I.
But in Matilda, they were heavily condemned.
Because they violated the gender norms of the era.
So the war truly ignites and becomes a full-blown crisis between 1139 and 1141. And the catalyst for this is Robert of Gloucester.
Matilda's illegitimate half-brother.
Right. He is one of the wealthiest men in the Anglo-Norman world, and in 1138 he officially renounces his fealty to Stephen.
Robert's defection was the signal the Angevins had been waiting for. It triggered a major regional rebellion in Kent and across the southwest of England, where Robert held massive estates.
Stephen recognized the severity of the threat and began preparing the kingdom for a prolonged conflict. He responds by creating a series of new earldoms.
Yes, he places men he considers completely loyal, like the Beaumont twins, into positions of power across vulnerable counties to create buffer zones.
But he also takes a very aggressive domestic step in 1139 that backfires severely.
The arrest of the bishops.
Right. He holds a royal court at Oxford and arrests a group of powerful bishops, including Roger of Salisbury.
Now, Roger of Salisbury was not just a bishop, he was the head of the royal administration.
He controlled the exchequer and the judicial system.
He and his nephews held several heavily fortified stone castles. And Stephen suspected, likely with good reason, that Roger was preparing to hand those castles over to Matilda.
So Stephen arrested the bishops and forced them to surrender their fortifications.
Yes.
From a purely military standpoint, taking those castles makes sense. You neutralize a threat before it materializes. But strategically, it was a profound error in statecraft.
It was a disaster. By arresting the senior clergy without a trial, Stephen alienated the church.
He directly angered his brother, Henry of Winchester.
Right, who was the papal legate and the very man who had secured the throne for him in the first place. Stephen traded long-term institutional support for short-term military assets.
And just as Stephen is dealing with the fallout from the church, the invasion happens. In September 1139, Empress Matilda and Robert of Gloucester land at Arundel on the southern coast of England with a small advance force of knights.
Stephen responds rapidly, demonstrating his talent for swift troop movements. He marches south, besieges Arundel Castle, and successfully traps Matilda inside.
He has his primary rival completely cornered just days after she lands.
He has her right where he wants her.
And then Stephen does something that leaves historians scratching their heads to this day. He agrees to a truce, proposed by his brother Henry, releases Matilda from the siege, and gives her a royal escort to travel safely to the southwest to reunite with Robert of Gloucester at Bristol.
He just lets her go.
Why? I mean, was this pure chivalry or a monumental strategic blunder?
Well, it was likely a complex combination of both. Chivalry was firmly established as a guiding principle for the warrior elite. Executing highborn prisoners or targeting noble women was deeply frowned upon.
Capturing a woman didn't fit neatly into the rules of feudal warfare.
No, it didn't. Additionally, Stephen may have believed that Robert of Gloucester, the military commander, was his actual primary opponent.
He might have feared tying his army down in a long, difficult siege at Arundel, while Robert roamed freely, gathering forces in the west.
That is a very plausible strategic rationale.
But it is still a profound miscalculation. Whatever his reasoning, releasing her allowed the Angevins to establish a compact, highly defensible block of territory in the southwest.
Yes, Matilda sets up her court in Gloucester, and a grueling stalemate sets in.
For 2 years, the conflict evolved into a series of localized skirmishes and sieges. Neither side could strike a decisive blow.
The war bogged down into the exact type of attritional chevauchée we discussed earlier.
But the stalemate breaks dramatically in 1141, and it all centers around Lincoln Castle in the north.
Ranulph of Chester.
Yes, Ranulph, a powerful baron who is furious with Stephen for granting northern lands to the Scottish Prince Henry. Ranulph seizes Lincoln Castle through a ruse.
And Stephen initially travels north and agrees to a fragile truce with Ranulph. But shortly after Stephen leaves, he receives intelligence from the citizens of Lincoln that Ranulph is relaxing in the castle with a minimal guard force.
Sensing an opportunity to remove a dangerous wildcard, Stephen abandons the truce.
He races back north and places the castle under siege.
He traps Ranulph's wife and brother inside, but Ranulph himself manages to slip through the siege lines.
Which proves to be a fatal mistake for Stephen.
Because Ranulph immediately rides south and declares his support for Empress Matilda, he joins forces with Robert of Gloucester, and they advance on Stephen's position at Lincoln with a much larger army, heavily supplemented by Welsh mercenaries.
So Stephen is suddenly outnumbered. He holds a council of war to decide whether to withdraw his forces or stand and fight.
And many of his advisors urged him to retreat.
They did. But burdened perhaps by that shadow of his father's cowardice, Stephen decides to fight. He refuses to run.
This leads to the Battle of Lincoln on the 2nd of February, 1141. It is one of the rare pitched battles of the entire war, and it gives us a clear look at battlefield tactics.
Robert and Ranulph had overwhelming superiority in cavalry.
How does Stephen counter that?
Stephen employed a tactic that was becoming increasingly common in Anglo-Norman warfare. He dismounted many of his own knights, taking them off their horses, to form a solid infantry block. He joined this infantry center himself.
Explain the mechanism behind that. Why take heavily armored knights off their horses?
A horse will rarely charge directly into a solid wall of men in shields. By dismounting his knights, Stephen created an unbreakable shield wall designed to absorb the enemy cavalry charge and hold the center of the battlefield.
It provided stability.
It did, but the tactic only works if your flanks hold.
And Stephen's flanks collapsed almost immediately.
Yes, after some initial skirmishing, Robert and Ranulph's cavalry completely shattered the Royalist cavalry on the wings.
Many of the king's allies, including the mercenary commander William of Ypres, saw the battle turning and fled from the field to save their own forces.
Leaving the center completely exposed.
The center holds, but it is completely encircled. And here we see the fatal flaw of the dismounted knight.
Right, because once the flanks collapse and you are surrounded, a knight in heavy chainmail armor on foot is too slow to maneuver.
They lose all mobility.
They effectively become sitting ducks against repeated cavalry charges. The battle turned into a slaughter.
But Stephen refused to surrender.
He fought on. The chroniclers provide a vivid, almost mythological description of his final stand.
It is a striking image. He fights fiercely on foot. First, he fights with his sword until the blade physically shatters against the enemy armor.
And then, a citizen of Lincoln hands him a heavy battle axe.
And Stephen continues to fight, swinging the axe until he's finally physically exhausted, overwhelmed by sheer numbers, and taken into custody.
A king swinging a battle axe, surrounded by his enemies, abandoned by his lords.
The implications of this capture are profound. Capturing the king at Lincoln completely upended the entire structure of the state.
The medieval system of governance relied heavily on the physical presence and active authority of the monarch. The king was the supreme judge, the distributor of land, and the military commander.
With Stephen imprisoned in chains at Bristol Castle, the royal administration simply ceased to function.
The oaths of fealty that bound the barons to the king were suddenly thrown into limbo.
If the king cannot protect you, do you still owe him military service?
That was the question every baron was asking themselves.
Matilda wastes no time. She understands she has a narrow window to secure the kingdom. She secures the royal treasury at Winchester, though it only had Stephen's crown left in it, the money was long gone.
Right.
And she makes a private deal with Henry of Blois to gain the church's backing. She advances to London in June 1141 to stage her coronation.
On paper, she has won. She has the rival king imprisoned, she holds the treasury buildings, and she has the support of the papal legate.
The coronation seems like a mere formality.
But she fundamentally miscalculates the political climate of London.
London had always been Stephen's stronghold. Forces loyal to the royalist cause remained mobilized just across the river, keeping the citizens in a state of high anxiety.
And Matilda makes it worse. Instead of courting the Londoners, she alienates them entirely.
He demanded a tellage, right?
Yes, a heavy arbitrary tax on the city to fund her army. The Londoners pleaded poverty, citing the years of war, but Matilda was completely unyielding.
The chroniclers report she treated the city leaders with open contempt.
So on the 24th of June, just days before she is meant to be crowned at Westminster, the crowds of London rise up against her.
The city bells ring, calling the militia to arms. It is a chaotic scene. She is sitting at dinner when the mob approaches.
And she and her followers have to flee the city in a desperate, disorganized retreat, galloping toward Oxford.
She was days away from the crown, and she lost the capital.
And this is where the momentum shifts entirely, driven by an unexpected figure.
While Stephen was sitting in chains at Bristol, his wife, Queen Matilda of Boulogne, stepped forward to rally the royalist cause.
It is an incredible irony of this conflict. You have Empress Matilda fighting to assert a woman's right to rule, and she is ultimately defeated not by King Stephen, but by his wife, Queen Matilda, commanding the royalist armies.
Queen Matilda of Boulogne was a highly effective political and military leader. She gathered Stephen's remaining lieutenants, including William of Bearers, and took command of the royal household.
She utilized her own vast wealth from the county of Boulogne to hire mercenaries.
And she generated genuine sympathy and support from Stephen's loyal followers by projecting the image of a devoted wife fighting for her unjustly imprisoned husband.
Following the Empress's retreat from London, Robert of Gloucester and Empress Matilda march on Winchester to besiege Henry of Blois.
Because he had switched sides again.
Exactly. But Queen Matilda sees an opportunity. She brings her royalist forces down and encircles the besiegers. She traps the trappers.
This becomes known as a Rout of Winchester in July 1141.
The logistics of the encirclement were a nightmare for the Angevins. Queen Matilda cut off their supply lines, leaving them starving within the city.
When the Angevins finally attempted a breakout retreat, the royalist forces pursued them relentlessly.
Empress Matilda barely managed to escape, riding furiously to Devizes.
But her half-brother and chief military commander, Robert of Gloucester, commanded the rear guard and was captured by Queen Matilda's forces.
So now both sides have captured the opposing side's primary leader.
Queen Matilda holds Robert of Gloucester. Empress Matilda holds King Stephen.
They spend months trying to negotiate a complex, long-term peace treaty, but neither side will compromise their core claims.
Finally, in November 1141, they abandon the Grand Treaty and agree to a straight, simple swap, King Stephen for Robert of Gloucester.
It is a dizzying exchange of high-value captives that essentially resets the political board back to exactly where it was before the Battle of Lincoln.
But with a crucial difference.
Right. Both sides are now severely depleted in resources, manpower, and morale. The brief hope for a decisive end to the war evaporates.
Stephen falls ill shortly after his release from prison, but he recovers and goes back on the offensive in 1142. He is determined to capture Empress Matilda.
He tracks her to Oxford Castle.
The castle is heavily defended, protected by thick walls and the surrounding river Isis.
And Stephen recognizes that a standard siege might take too long, allowing Robert of Gloucester to bring a relief force.
So he leads a sudden, daring assault across the river.
He leads the charge himself, swimming part of the way across the freezing water in his armor to seize a bridgehead.
His men break into the town, trapping the Empress inside the stone keep of Oxford Castle. He settles in for a winter siege, confident that she finally has nowhere to go.
But Empress Matilda executes one of the most famous escapes in English history.
She is trapped in the keep, food is running out, and Stephen's army surrounds the walls. But just before Christmas in 1142, a severe freeze sets in. The river freezes solid, and a heavy snow falls.
Taking advantage of the weather, she wraps herself in a white cloak as camouflage against the snow.
She and a few loyal knights sneak out of a postern gate, lower themselves down the walls, and walk directly across the frozen River Thames on foot.
They slip entirely unnoticed past the royal army's siege lines and travel through the freezing night to safety at Wallingford.
The garrison at Oxford surrenders the very next day, but the prize is gone.
It was an extraordinary escape.
This sequence of dramatic captures, sieges, and daring escapes over 1141 and 42 ultimately led to total exhaustion on both sides. The war in England bogs down into a grinding, devastating stalemate spanning from 1143 to 1146.
Neither faction possessed the logistical capacity or the financial resources to knock the other out completely.
Stephen controlled the southeast and London. Matilda and Robert controlled the southwest.
And the Midlands became a fractured, burning borderland where local barons constantly switched allegiances to protect their own interests.
While the war in England stalls, Geoffrey of Anjou is making serious permanent gains in Normandy.
He systematically reduces the Norman castles, eventually capturing Rouen in 1144, effectively securing control over the entire duchy.
He is officially recognized as the Duke of Normandy by the French king, Louis VII.
This separation of England and Normandy created a substantial crisis for the Anglo-Norman barons. The elite families held extensive lands on both sides of the Channel.
Now, they face an impossible choice.
If they supported Stephen in England, they risked Geoffrey confiscating their ancestral lands in Normandy. If they supported Matilda, they risked Stephen seizing their English estates.
It fractures their loyalties. Back in England, Stephen feels his support eroding. Major barons are hedging their bets, maintaining neutrality, or secretly negotiating with the Angevins.
Out of desperation to hold his territory, Stephen begins relying on blatant deceit.
In 1143, he invites Geoffrey de Mandeville to the royal court.
Geoffrey de Mandeville was a highly ambitious baron who controlled the Tower of London and several other critical fortifications near the capital. He had repeatedly switched sides during the conflict, extorting titles from both Stephen and Matilda.
Stephen decides he can no longer trust him.
He arrests Mandeville at court and threatens to execute him unless he hands over those castles.
Mandeville complies to save his life, but the moment he is free, he launches a fierce, destructive rebellion in the fens of East Anglia.
And Stephen repeats this exact trick 3 years later.
He invites Ranulph of Chester to court in 1146, arrests him, and forces him to hand over Lincoln Castle and Coventry.
And just like Mandeville, Ranulph rebels the second he is released.
We talked about how arresting the bishops was a mistake. This strategy highlights the absolute total breakdown of the feudal contract.
Yes, Stephen gained immediate military assets. He got the physical castles he desperately needed to protect London in the north, but he permanently destroyed the fundamental trust required to be a feudal overlord.
The entire system relied on the king's word.
If a baron is granted safe conduct to attend the royal court, he must be safe. By arresting his own barons at court, Stephen demonstrated that his word meant nothing.
We also see the deaths of key figures during this grueling stalemate. Miles of Gloucester, one of Matilda's most talented and loyal commanders, dies in a bizarre hunting accident, accidentally shot by an arrow.
And Geoffrey de Mandeville is shot by a crossbowman during a siege and dies of the infection.
The central authority of the crown was eroding so rapidly that it impacted every aspect of daily life. We see this most clearly in the economy.
The royal control over minting coins completely breaks down.
This is a crucial point for understanding the scale of the collapse. Under Henry I, coinage was strictly controlled by the central exchequer to ensure the silver content was consistent. It maintained the value of the currency.
But during the stalemate, local barons and bishops across the country simply set up their own mints.
They began striking their own currency to pay their local mercenary troops and manage their regional economies.
They heavily debased the coins, mixing the silver with cheap alloys.
It is like if the central banking system collapsed today and the mayor of your town just started printing his own local dollars to pay the police force, while the next town over printed a different currency.
It causes rampant inflation. It destroys trade because merchants refuse to accept worthless local coins, and it is the ultimate symptom that the central state has ceased to exist.
The economic suffering of the peasantry during this period cannot be overstated. With armies burning the crops, barons extorting taxes to build unauthorized castles, and the currency rendered worthless, widespread famine took hold in several regions.
It was a very dark time.
This brings us to 1147, and the character of the conflict begins to shift. A new generation enters the board, and the path to peace slowly, finally opens.
In 1147, Robert of Gloucester dies peacefully of a fever.
The following year, Empress Matilda returns to Normandy, leaving the campaign in England to her eldest son.
Enter Henry Fitzempress, the future King Henry II. He is young, fiercely energetic, and deeply intent on pressing his hereditary claim to the English throne.
He mounts a small mercenary invasion in 1147, but it is poorly planned.
He advances into England, but his campaign quickly stalls, and he actually runs out of funds to pay his mercenary troops.
And here's a detail from the Chronicles that is just baffling. Henry is stranded, his troops are demanding pay, and he appeals for help. And Stephen, the enemy king, actually sends him the money to pay his mercenaries' travel costs to go home.
It is quite a surprising action.
Wait, he pays his enemy's troops. That is like paying for your opponent's political attack ads? Why on earth would Stephen do that?
Well, it is a question that historians have debated extensively. On the surface, it could be viewed as a gesture of chivalric courtesy, which Stephen was known for. Henry was, after all, his young relative.
But strategically,
Strategically, it is highly likely that Stephen was starting to consider the endgame. He was getting older, the war was deadlocked, and by paying Henry's men and allowing him to leave safely, Stephen was opening a diplomatic channel.
he was building a baseline relationship with the young man who was quickly becoming his primary rival, signaling that he might be open to future negotiations.
Exactly. Henry returns to Normandy, but his power surges astronomically in 1152.
He unexpectedly marries Eleanor of Aquitaine.
She is the recently divorced wife of the French king, Louis VII, and she was arguably the most powerful woman in Europe.
She brings with her a vast swath of territory across southern France.
Yes, Henry is suddenly immensely wealthy and powerful, controlling an empire that stretches from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees.
Meanwhile, back in England, Stephen is desperately trying to secure his own legacy. He wants to ensure that his family keeps the throne after his death.
He demands that his eldest son, Eustace, be crowned as co-king while Stephen is still alive.
This was a common practice in France to guarantee a smooth succession, but it was not traditional in England. Stephen demands that Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury crown Eustace at Easter 1152.
Theobald flatly refuses. He states that he cannot crown Eustace without the agreement of the Pope, and the papacy, influenced by Angevin diplomats, had forbidden the English Church from participating in the coronation.
Stephen's response shows his mounting frustration. He temporarily imprisons Theobald and the bishops in a house, trying to physically force their hand.
But Theobald manages to escape down the Thames and flees into exile. The Church will not sanction Eustace's succession. Stephen's attempt to secure his dynasty fails.
The climax arrives in 1153. Henry Fitzempress invades England again, this time with a small but highly professional army.
He secures support in the Midlands and the North, capturing several royalist castles.
The two forces finally converge at the Siege of Wallingford. Stephen's army and Henry's army face off across the River Thames. The lines are drawn. It looks like the decisive pitched battle is finally here.
But the battle never happens. The barons on both sides essentially go on strike.
That is wild. The leading barons and church officials from both factions intervened.
They had endured 19 years of localized conflict. Their lands were devastated, their treasuries were drained, and they recognized that a pitched battle between the king and the duke would only lead to further chaos, regardless of who won.
They stepped in and brokered a truce, directly against the aggressive wishes of both King Stephen and Henry.
Eustace, Stephen's son, is furious. He sees his inheritance slipping away. He leaves his father's camp in a rage, returns to Cambridge to gather funds to continue the war himself by ravaging church lands.
But he falls ill and dies the very next month.
Eustace's sudden death removed the most significant obstacle to a negotiated peace. With Stephen's immediate aggressive heir gone, the king's resolve to continue the fight collapsed.
The path was clear to settle the succession crisis once and for all. This leads directly to the Treaty of Winchester, also known as the Treaty of Wallingford, signed in November 1153.
The terms are a masterclass in political compromise.
Stephen is allowed to remain King of England for the rest of his life, retaining his dignity and title. But he formally adopts Henry Fitzempress as his son and recognizes him as his sole legitimate heir.
It provided an elegant legal fiction to end the war. Stephen's surviving younger son, William, is guaranteed his extensive lands and personal safety, but he must formally renounce any claim to the throne.
The treaty also ordered that the foreign mercenaries be paid off and expelled, and that the unauthorized castles built during the war be demolished. The treaty is sealed with a kiss of peace in Winchester Cathedral.
The peace was initially precarious, but Stephen throws himself into reasserting royal authority, traveling the country to enforce the treaty terms.
However, less than a year later, in October 1154, Stephen falls ill with a stomach disorder and dies in Dover.
Henry II crosses the Channel unopposed and is crowned King of England in December.
Henry immediately sets to work consolidating his power. He expels the remaining Flemish mercenaries, stripping them of the lands Stephen had granted them.
He aggressively continues the process of tearing down the adulterine castles that had plagued the countryside, removing the physical bases of baronial independence.
He restores the royal finances, reviving the rigorous exchequer processes of his grandfather, Henry I.
And as Henry rebuilds the administrative state, a specific narrative of the Civil War begins to take shape. This brings us to the historiography of the period, how history remembers this conflict.
Right, because the very term, the Anarchy, was not used by the people who lived through it. It was coined much later by Victorian historians like William Stubbs and John Round in the late 19th century.
The Victorians looked at the breakdown of the English Constitution, the localized minting of coins, and the horrific accounts of torture and starvation from monastic chroniclers, and they labeled the entire 19-year period as an era of pure, unmitigated chaos.
But was it truly widespread anarchy across the entire kingdom?
Modern historians have heavily nuanced that view. The devastation was very real, but it was highly regionalized.
While areas like the Southwest, the Thames Valley, and parts of East Anglia saw serious, continuous raiding and economic collapse, other regions were largely unaffected by the fighting.
Stephen's heartlands in the southeast and London functioned with relative normality. His administration continued to issue charters and hear court cases.
Up in the north, David I of Scotland ruled effectively and maintained order. The breakdown in law and order varied greatly depending on geography and the strength of the local lord.
So we have a functioning administration in parts of the country, but a narrative that the entire kingdom was engulfed in darkness.
What does this tell us? It reveals that Henry II cleverly weaponized the memory of Stephen's reign. The new Angevin government needed a propaganda campaign.
They painted the prior 19 years as an absolute dark age, an unbroken period of violence resulting solely from Stephen's usurpation.
By doing so, Henry cast himself as the sole bringer of light, order, and legitimate rule. If Stephen's reign was pure anarchy, then Henry was the savior restoring the golden age of his grandfather.
The concept of the anarchy was as much a political narrative constructed by the victors to legitimize their dynasty as it was a reflection of historical reality.
It is a profound manipulation of history. The physical scars on the landscape were absolutely real, but the political memory of the war was actively shaped and molded by the very people who won it. As we close this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over regarding causality. We've traced 19 years of grueling sieges, complex betrayals, shifting borders, and the birth of the vast Angevin Empire under Henry II.
An empire that would shape the politics of Western Europe for centuries.
But none of it, none of the attritional warfare, none of the political restructuring, none of the devastation that led people to believe Christ and his saints were asleep, would have happened if it were not for one night in 1120. If Thomas Fitzstephen, the captain of the White Ship, and his crew had simply stayed sober on that cold evening off the coast of Barfleur, William Adelin would have lived. He would have inherited the throne smoothly. There would have been no succession crisis, no disputed oaths, and potentially no Angevin empire. It is a striking reminder of how the grandest sweeps of political history, the treaties, the battles, and the fate of entire nations can hinge entirely on a single mundane human error. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.